In April 2024, Bonza Airlines, Australia's newest low-cost bet, declared bankruptcy without warning. Passengers found out through their phones. Some were already at the airport. Others discovered it when check-in simply never opened. 3 months later, in July, it was Rex Airlines' turn. Nearly 700 employees lost their jobs in a single morning. 1.2 million passengers had their bookings canceled. And the day after Rex collapsed, fares between Adelaide and Melbourne jumped 95%. 95% in a single day. That wasn't an accident. It wasn't market shock, and it wasn't a surprise to anyone who understands Australian aviation. Because what happened in 2024 wasn't an unexpected tragedy, it was the system working exactly as it was designed to work. Why has Australia, one of the wealthiest countries in the developed world, built a domestic aviation market where competing is nearly impossible and where passengers always foot the bill?
Aviate has reached 20,000 subscribers passionate about aviation. Our sincere thanks for your support. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications.
Australia spans 7.7 million square kilometers. For context, the entire continent of Europe fits within Australia's borders with room to spare. Perth on the western coast is farther from Sydney than London is from Moscow.
Now, here's the thing. In other continental-scale countries with this problem, there's a way out. Europe has high-speed rail that gets you from Paris to London in 2.5 hours. Japan has the Shinkansen. In the United States, cars cover medium distances, and there's still a passenger rail network connecting major cities in the east.
Australia is different. There is no high-speed train between Sydney and Melbourne, and while highways cross the country, the distances are so extreme and the terrain so isolated that driving simply isn't a practical alternative between major cities. Flying in Australia isn't a preference, it's the only option. And that creates something extraordinarily valuable and extraordinarily dangerous when concentrated in few hands: inelastic demand. Inelastic means people need the product regardless of price. If you live in Perth and need to see your family in Sydney or attend a business meeting in Melbourne, you have no alternative. You will buy that ticket, whatever the price. Economists call this market power. In plain language, when you control the only product people can't go without, you set the price wherever you want. Now, imagine it's not one company holding that power, it's two, and that every time someone has tried to enter that market over the last 35 years, the intruder gets eliminated. This isn't economic theory. This is the history of Australian aviation, and the numbers back up every word. Let's talk history, because this is where things get strange. A lot of people outside Australia remember Ansett. For decades, it was the country's second largest carrier, a direct rival to Qantas. In September 2001, a week when the entire world was distracted, Ansett collapsed. 30,000 employees, more than 1 million passengers with nowhere to fly. It was one of the largest corporate collapses in Australian history. But Ansett wasn't the beginning, and it definitely wasn't the end. Compass Airlines tried in 1990. It lasted less than 2 years before being forced to shut down. It tried again in 1992. It folded again in 1993.
Impulse Airlines arrived in the early 2000s with aggressive fares and competitive routes. It didn't last long. It was absorbed by Qantas, which then folded it into Jetstar. Tiger Airways, the Australian arm of the Asian budget carrier, spent years trying to build a sustainable operation. In 2020, during the pandemic, Virgin shut it down. Bonza launched in 2023 with optimism and routes to smaller cities that the major carriers ignored. It died in April 2024. And Rex, which had operated as a regional carrier for decades with deep roots in outback communities, decided to expand into the Golden Triangle, the 3 most lucrative routes in the country: Sydney-Melbourne, Sydney-Brisbane, and Melbourne-Brisbane. It was wiped out in July 2024. That's 6 serious attempts at competition over 35 years. Not one survived. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because when you have 6 attempts at competition and 6 failures, there are exactly 2 possible explanations. The first is collective bad luck, that 6 different companies in different decades with different business models simply weren't good enough. The second explanation is that the system was built for them to fail. And the data points clearly to the second option. When Rex announced its expansion into the Golden Triangle in 2021, the incumbents' response was immediate.
Qantas increased Jetstar capacity on the same routes Rex had begun operating, driving prices down and intensifying competition beyond what Rex could sustain in the long term.
At the same time, it launched operations on 10 regional routes that formed the financial backbone of Rex's business, the routes where Rex had history, customer loyalty, and operational efficiency. This was confirmed publicly by John Sharp, former chairman of Rex, in an interview with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation's investigative program, Four Corners. Sharp stated explicitly that Qantas used its low-cost operations to squeeze Rex on the capital city routes while simultaneously attacking its regional revenue base. The ACCC, Australia's competition regulator, investigated and said it found no illegal behavior. It didn't say it didn't happen, it said only that it wasn't illegal. That distinction matters more than it might seem. This is where the argument moves out of the realm of opinion and into the realm of math. The ACCC itself, the same authority that said it found no illegal behavior, published data on the impact of competition on domestic airfare prices in Australia. The numbers are brutal. On routes served by only one airline, the average cost per kilometer flown is 39.6 Australian cents. With 2 airlines competing, it drops to 28.2 cents. With 3, 19.2 cents. To put that in perspective, a passenger flying from Sydney to Perth, a distance of roughly 3,300 kilometers, almost the same as flying from Los Angeles to New York, would pay on average over $400 more on a monopoly route than on a route with 3 competitors, each trip, each way. And after Rex collapsed on the capital city routes, Adelaide-Melbourne fares jumped 95% within weeks.
That's not theory, that's what happened. That's the Australian market running without a break. But the price numbers are only half the story, because the barrier to entry isn't just financial, it's structural. And this is where the system becomes truly impenetrable. Airport slots in Australian airports, especially Sydney Airport, the country's busiest, are a finite resource. You can't create new slots at a congested airport any more than you can create new rush hour windows on a packed New York subway. And who manages the allocation of those slots at Sydney Airport? A company called Sydney Airport Coordination, majority funded by Qantas and Virgin. Think carefully about what that means. The very companies that dominate the market have direct influence over who gets permission to operate during the most valuable hours at the country's central airport. It's as if American Airlines and United controlled who could fly peak hours at O'Hare. And there's more. The Australian corporate travel market, business travelers who pay the highest fares and fly most frequently, is 80% controlled by Qantas. That means any new airline entering the market starts, by definition, locked out of the highest margin segment. No slots at premium hours, no access to the corporate market, no ability to absorb temporary losses while building scale. Large airlines can operate a route below cost for long enough to destroy a smaller competitor, then reprice once the competitor disappears. Qantas and Virgin have that capability. No new entrant does. It is mathematically impossible for a new airline to survive long enough to build the scale needed to compete. The system guarantees it. This is where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable. When Rex collapsed in July 2024, the Australian government moved quickly. It injected 130 million Australian dollars to keep operations running during administration.
It bought $50 million of the company's debt. It guaranteed fares for affected passengers. These were emergency measures. They were necessary. Hundreds of regional communities depend on REX for basic access to healthcare, supplies, and connections to urban centers. But the government did not reform the system that caused the collapse. And that brings us to a detail that tends to disappear from official statements. Reportedly,
Australian members of parliament have access to travel benefits from major airlines, raising ongoing concerns about potential conflicts of interest in aviation policy decisions.
we're not talking about accusations of explicit corruption. We're talking about something more subtle and, in some ways, more troubling: the normalization of privileged access. When regulators travel on the loyalty programs of the companies they regulate, the distance between the public interest and corporate interest begins to shrink in ways that are hard to measure but easy to observe in the outcomes. The Sydney Airport slot reform was passed in November 2024, a full year after the collapse that made the urgency impossible to ignore. Aviation experts were unanimous: the reform was insufficient. It doesn't fundamentally change who controls access to the most valuable time windows. And in February 2026, the cheapest fares in Australian domestic routes cost 9% more than the same period the year before. Not because oil prices spiked, not because of a natural disaster or currency crisis, but because when competition disappears, prices do the only thing they do. Speaking of which, there is one concrete proposal in the Australian policy debate that could actually shift this dynamic.
Professor Alan Fels, one of Australia's most respected economists on competition policy, put forward a radical idea: force Qantas to divest Jetstar, fully separate the two airlines, turning them into independent competitors instead of coordinated arms of the same corporate strategy. The logic is elegant. If Jetstar existed as an independent company, it would compete against Qantas on high-volume routes. That would create real price pressure at both the top and bottom of the market simultaneously, without depending on a third new entrant that's impossible to adequately capitalize. Qantas responded that the measure would raise prices for consumers without presenting any data to support the claim. The government did not act. In 2024, while two airlines were collapsing, an announcement emerged that generated equal parts hope and universal skepticism among industry experts: Koala Airlines. CEO Bill Aisling publicly declared that Australia has room for a third major competitor, that the market is ripe for a real alternative, that Koala will fill the void left by Bonza and Rex. But Aisling didn't reveal which routes it plans to fly, didn't reveal how much financing it has secured, didn't reveal a concrete launch date. An aviation consultant, quoted by the Australian press, summed up the situation with a line that became something of a catchphrase in industry circles: the only worse way to burn money in Australia than launching an airline is perhaps running a winery. This brings us to the central question: not whether Koala will try, but what it will find when it does. The slots remain concentrated, the corporate market remains 80% controlled by Qantas, the incumbent's ability to operate below cost on specific routes remains intact. Rex, it should be said, didn't disappear entirely. It was acquired by an American investment group and continues operating its regional routes, the connections to small towns that are literally the only transportation available to those communities. But the capital city routes, the Golden Triangle Rex tried to claim, they didn't come back. Fares on those routes didn't fall. Bonza was not replaced by any new operator on the cities it served, and the cycle is preparing to turn again. Australia has built, over decades, an aviation market that works with perfect efficiency for the two airlines that dominate it. For everyone else, it's a trap. Geography guarantees demand. Market concentration guarantees prices. Structural barriers guarantee that new entrants can't survive long enough to threaten the duopoly. And the political arrangement guarantees that meaningful reform stays permanently on the horizon, always being discussed, never being implemented with enough force to matter.
The result is that Australians pay some of the highest domestic fares in the developed world to cross their own country. Not because Australia is poor, not because aviation is technically more expensive there, but because the market was built and maintained that way. Australia is too large to function without aviation, and too small in terms of market density to have real competition without structural intervention. Until that changes, and there are few signs that it will, Australians will keep paying. Always.